Meryl, I'll see what I can do to live up to that particular description. First off, just thanks to everybody for participating, and thanks to Clue for having this wonderful venue. We're able to talk about games in our studio. I'm going to start off with a little bit of a story, I guess. That's probably the best way for me to do that. But probably when I was a kid in the early 80s here in town, I remember going shopping with my mom to a place that no longer exists anymore. It's called Shopper City West. Everybody knows it today as College Square. And I'd end up bumming as many quarters as I possibly could to be able to run to the arcade in the back and play all the games I possibly could. And my mom was always telling me at the time that, it's never going to go anywhere. It's a waste of money. And of course, money was pretty tight at that time because, we didn't have any of it. So I was just fascinated by it, but it actually led me to find this very interesting cartoon, which I think some of my coworkers and my esteemed colleagues that are here as well today, catching a bit of this, have probably seen me talk about this one quite a bit. But I'm going to talk about the work of play and give you an inside view of the business of games and jump right to something that was a huge influence for me growing up, which is The Far Side. So this was a satirical cartoon that came out in 1990, and I remember looking at this in the newspaper and thinking exactly the same thing that Gary Larson did. So you see a kid playing on a Nintendo device, because that was the biggest console at the time during those days. And it's called Hopeful Parents, and essentially what it boils down to is this, right? So it's a satirical taking a look at somebody supporting a kid playing video games as opposed to getting real actual skills in the world. And what I found was really interesting throughout all this was fast forward from 1990 to 2005 when I was working at an EA studio. Take a look at some of these numbers that are here. So with close up on the actual cartoon itself, we see asking for people for different skills at 50K, 100K, 150K. So the actual salary range here ranges from 50 to 150. But the really interesting thing is that I had a team of 23 people reporting to me at that time, and these were exactly the types of salaries that these people were making working for a AAA studio at that time. So it's kind of neat to see that how we've seen this go full circle from something that people would sneer at to this wonderful genre that we're working in, that we're playing in. And this is actually a reflection of the reality of 2005 in some studios. So I thought that was a really good place for me to take a look at this and start. And basically, I try to put this cartoon up in every workspace wherever I've worked since finding it again in 2003, 2004. I actually had to dig for it at the time, as it wasn't quite as prolific on the internet as it is today. So talking about today, I do have my chat window open, so I'll try and keep an eye on any questions that do come across. I might miss them just because I'm talking, but please keep poking, and I'll try and take various pauses along the way and see if there are any questions that come up. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of my experience in the business of games. Start off with a little bit about me, not too much, but more about our studio and some of the things that I've seen by way of business trends coming along over the last 20 odd years or so of making games. So without any further ado, all right, yeah, this is my favorite thing because I'm the old guy in the studio. Looking back, way back in the day, some of the people that I've worked with have probably seen this, but back in the 80s, I started in the cadet system. I wasn't very good at school, but I was very good at marching around and putting on a uniform and yelling drill commands and things of that nature. That led me in the 1990s to grabbing probably a better hold on the military life. So I had the chance to basically be a soldier running around, jumping out of helicopters and things like that, which is kind of fun. Which led very logically to me, of course, working in software development. So that's not exactly true. This is actually the building on Montcalm Avenue where I had joined a software company and became a partner in that software company after the first 6 to 8 months. And we built that up to about, I guess, 90 employees and market valuation of about 10 mil. So that was really a big formative experience for me, going from technical support to building up a software company with many employees and running all aspects of software development at that time. So we were doing Win32 three-tier database development at that time, which basically at that time, I had a partner on the West Coast. She was a police officer. We ended up moving out there. And finally, in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, I found myself in Vancouver. And for me, this was an amazing thing. I always wanted to be on the West Coast. And of course, like everything I always do is rather bombastic and plant a flag in the ground and say, I'm never going to leave, which is kind of funny as I'm sitting here in Ottawa. And one thing I was also doing in Vancouver was taking a look at other things that I'd like to do and seeing this wonderful castle on the hill and thinking maybe one day I'll see inside it. For those of you who had a chance to be out there, this is EA Canada. So I actually ended up working there after a couple of years, which was kind of neat. So during that whole period, I had the chance to work on the marketing aspects of Majora's Mask, which is a lot of fun. But that led me to working with a local studio and working a little bit on some hockey. After that, I did some survival horror. And horror, I'm not a huge horror fan, and the people around me know this as well that I work with. Horror is not my favorite genre at all. In fact, this game spooked me out to work on it. I was a producer on both these titles, and it still kind of spooks me out today. And on top of that, I think the next phase after that was working on some racing titles in a different studio. So I moved to the Need for Speed series, had a chance to work on that as a development director, doing project management for a team of about, I guess the core team was 90, the full team was about 350 when he had all the subcontractors in there. I did a little bit of pre-pro on Most Wanted, and then moved on to work on a game called Marvel Nemesis Rise of the Imperfects, which was kind of fun. I ended up living in California for a while to get that one done too. So, yes, there's the funny thing is that as soon as I start working at a game studio, I'm like, I really don't want to screw this up. This is amazing. And I still feel that way today, which is great because I love what I do. I love the genre that I'm working with. I love the people that I work with. So it's a still common thing for me today. All right, so fast forward a bit to about 2007. And of course, after declaring that I'm never leaving, here I am back in Ottawa, expecting to stay for a couple of weeks. And it turns out I decided I wanted to have a change because I was burnt out from working very long hours in some of those studios. And I decided to go to Ottawa and study psych. And I told myself I'm out of games, going to be taking a big break. I've had my fun with technology. I'm going to go do something else and become a psychologist. So a friend of mine gave me a call in my second or third year through and said, "Hey, Nigel, I got this great idea. I just started a publisher and I've got a contract. I landed in Ottawa." And I said, "I'm not really sure. I don't think you understand. See, I'm going to be this healer psychologist guy." And he said, No. So it's going to be great. You really got to come. Have one of these. And so I just basically said, what can I say? So essentially I joined up with him and we ended up making some really cool advert games. So we made a game based on the Sour Patch Kids and a few others as well. So through that process, I got to meet some really great people and some really great local companies here, some of which I have the luck of working with now again today, from a great market leader like Bidheads. Unfortunately, Fuel's no longer with us, but Fuel actually started, was basically the impetus for starting Snowed In, which is awesome, which is great. So on top of that, got to work on some mobile stuff with a studio on the East Coast called Other Ocean. I think they've been purchased by EA now, which is great. Good for them. So that's a little bit about some of my background. So from 2014 to 19, made a whole bunch of TV apps with a local company here. Got to learn a lot about all the OTT devices and worked a little bit on Twitch too, which is kind of cool. And now, today, happily with Snowed In Studios, and it's really interesting. I've had the opportunity to view a whole pile of different studios over my career, either as an outsourcer or as an exterior senior producer or executive producer managing these studios. And I have to say, this is the first time I actually feel like I'm really at home. I'm so in love with the studio and all the people that are in it. It is an absolutely amazing experience. So having the opportunity of seeing many studios at the size of Snowed In over time is just one of the greatest places for me to be. And I'm really happy with it. And I'm really happy with the people, the fact that I'm challenged on a daily basis and that we're working on really cool, interesting projects the whole time through, and some really fantastic people. So I can't say enough good things about the place where I'm at. More than happy to talk about Snowed In until I am blue in the face, and I will happily do so. So a little bit about Snowed In. We've grown a lot over the last year and been around for about 10 years. Snowed In as a studio basically was a group of programmers that left Fuel Industries about 10 and a half, 11 years ago. And since then, basically went from contract to contract and grew the studio up to where we're at today, which is now 74. I think that this is now outdated. This was written last week. We're now at 75. So it's kind of cool. And we're going to continue that growth into the future. All right. So about gaming itself and the actual business. So I've been taking a look at a lot of different aspects of gaming, and including why it's got such a wide reach, because we're trying to educate some other people who are not necessarily familiar with the games business about some of the great things games can do. And really what it boils down to is gaming in and of itself, for those who aren't fully immersed in it, it is literally a cultural force, unlike anything we've seen since the invention of television, which changed everything back in the 50s. We know our population is just shy of 8 billion, and it's really interesting to find that people that play games around the planet is about a quarter of that, or over a quarter of that. So it's huge. We couldn't say this 10 years ago, definitely couldn't say it 20 years ago. So it's really neat to see how gaming has perforated almost everything, or permeated, I should say. And what's really interesting about this as well is Netflix is a phenomenon that did not exist 15 years ago in the format that it is right now. It started off as mail order, but what's really interesting is who they actually identify as their greatest threat. The first thing we think of are the big names that are competing for eyeballs. So whether it's cable TV or any of the other access channels that they have, but it's not. Netflix has actually publicly stated that Fortnite is the biggest threat to their survival and to their viewership, period, which came with a bit of a shock when I found that research online. But I kind of like it. From a cultural social currency standpoint, there's almost nobody in their preteen years that hasn't played Minecraft. It's gone everywhere. It's absolutely huge. So those of us in the industry obviously have had a lot of chance to play it, but a lot of people outside it has as well. So Fortnite in and of itself, or Minecraft in and of itself, changed so many different aspects of gaming for so many different people, where now they can construct entire worlds that they could live in, which is really great. Right. A couple of things about the games industry itself, which I thought was pretty interesting. I'm happy to share some of this information that not everybody may be aware of. Take a look at the numbers here about the size of the game market. This is 2019. The game market was worth 139 billion. And 20 years ago, we used to say, we're about almost as big as Hollywood. Hollywood at that time was 22 billion and games were actually 24 billion. But now it's far surpassed that. We don't even have to do comparisons. At that time, it was actually an incorrect comparison because Hollywood's real numbers came in DVD rentals and sales at that time, not actually the box office. So it's kind of neat. So we've got these really massive numbers as to how big the games industry is. But these are the things that I thought were really interesting, trying to educate other people about the games industry. They may not be familiar with it. Percentage of gamers over 18 right now is 75%. The average gamer age is 35, which is incredible because everybody, when you first talk to them about the games industry as a whole, will think that's great for kids. It's going to be awesome. It's fantastic. It's like, no, actually, gamers have grown up with this as part of their entire life. And now they're in the largest numbers of gamers out there that are playing are in this much higher age range. It's kind of cool. The best thing about this for me is seeing the gender gap close between male and female gamers, because at the end of the day, what that really means is that we end up getting better games, because the early games that were made, in my view, were all made by dudes for dudes, which is basically find a target, shoot it, kill it, and away you go. And that didn't appeal to all genders and classes and groups of people equally. Now that we've got more parity when it comes down to genders playing games, I think the end result is that we have more people, more women coming into the games industry as a whole, which is great. Which for me means we're going to be ending up having better games for everybody across the board. So I just think it's a great thing. It's awesome. I'm not going to be glossing over the issues in the games industry. I'll have a chance to talk about some of that as well. But it's just neat to see that things are moving in the right direction despite some of the issues that we see in the news these days. Right, so one final view of gaming about bigger than all of mainstream entertainment combined. And it's true. This was taken from a YouTube that I saw a little while ago and they quoted all the sources. I double checked the sources and it all adds up. So all mainstream entertainment, this primarily more North America centric though, still the games industry in North America far outdoes any of these other things, which is really cool to see. I think the video, it just said, hey, the NHL says, yay, we actually made it to the list. As a big hockey fan, that's something that I have to bear in mind. Right, so one last thing when it comes down to sports, take a wild guess which one had the largest number of viewers. And I think you kind of know from the numbers I've been showing already as to where this is actually going. So 23.25 million viewers for the 2015 NBA Finals, 27 million for the League of Legends World Championships. So it's kind of cool. And then Twitch as something else, which is a whole new thing that didn't exist with streaming until we have the YouTube age and the Twitch age coming up. 15 million people coming to see Twitch streams on a daily basis, which is incredible, absolutely amazing to see. We've got these great communities that are coming up, people sharing games. I remember having to explain this to a coworker once as to what Twitch was in another company. And he just looked at me and says, "What are you people, crazy? You mean you actually just go watch other people play games?" And it's really neat to see that that was his perspective, but having the opportunity to explain, well, games are expensive for a lot of people, right? So when you boil it down to an experience that you can then share socially with someone, you can actually get a lot of the game experience without having to have that constant capital output or deciding whether or not you're going to be spending the money on a game which you may not actually end up liking. And on top of that, community gets built and a phenomenon like Twitch gets launched. Right. So enough of all that. Everybody says, yeah, games is big, game is huge. I want to know how to make them. So I'm going to give you my perspective based on my experience. And with anything that I'm giving you here, please feel free to challenge it. Please feel free to tell me what your experiences are as well. I don't want to just be saying that this is the way that things are done, because everybody does things slightly differently. Every studio does things differently, and we all learn from each other, which is great. All right, has everybody seen this before? If, it's a really low quality vid, so I have to really apologize for it, but this one still cracks me up every day that I play it.
Well, hurry up, man. Box is coming in. Dude, almost got it.
Hey guys, finished testing that game yet? I've got another one I need designed.
We just finished level 3 and need to tighten up the graphics a little bit.
Great.
Hey, I can't believe we got jobs doing this.
I know. And my mom said I would never get anywhere with these games.
Go, Westwood College on.
Pew pew. Yeah, I just need to tighten up the graphics a little bit. So this one's the cause of a great deal of derision on our local game chat Slack channels, which is great. Westwood College kind of went out of business due to some other issues that they had with just finances and other things like that. They weren't exactly the most reputable business at the time, but it's funny to see that that's how they were portraying themselves in the 90s about game development. So I'm not going to go down that particular path, but I'm going to talk about a couple of different things and some of the things that I saw in my experience. And this is kind of targeted at people who are interested in coming into the games business, either working for a AAA studio or a services studio like ours, working on AAA projects, or even thinking of starting their own studio. Awesome, Cameron. Thank you. Love that. Right. So getting back to storytelling, back to this wonderful place, Vancouver, where I used to live, a couple of different buildings where I used to live in this picture as well. So I'm going to give you a tale of several studios. So take a look at the business. Skybox Labs has been around from 2011 doing services for other companies, and they've been doing quite well. They are continuing to do work on the Halo franchise right now and a few others. So after 9 years, they're still going strong, Vancouver-based studio. A small studio called Black Box Games started in 1998. They started doing sports titles. They did Sega Soccer Slam. They did NHL Hits 2000 to 2003, I believe it was. And then they started working on Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2. They had 2 separate game teams running, each of about 60, 65 people. So they were able to diversify their income with multiple game publishers. And therefore, if one of them had a break, then they could still have the other team taking care of their income coming in. Interesting about these guys, after they made Hot Pursuit 2, EA bought them for just shy of 20 mil. So after a very short period of time, here's the studio that did very well and then became integrated as part of became EA Black Box, with the usual caveats. When a publisher or some other group buys a company, they'll have the main people that started the company be part of their new organization for a minimum of about 3 to 5 years, depending. And then usually with a buyout, they'll get 70% of their buyout at the time that they purchase the company, and they'll get the remaining 10 to 25% after that period of time. And I think in the EA world right now for Black Box was probably 5 years. Another example of a West Coast studio, Next Level Games. Some of these people came out of Black Box. They didn't want to be working for EA, so they started their own studio. So they worked on NHL Hits Pro and some things for Mario Strikers. Did a Spider-Man title, a Captain America title. After 18 years, the studio is still going strong with somewhere around 120, 130 people. That's pretty unheard of in the games business for an independent studio running for 18 years. We have a few examples, probably less than 15 that have been running that long. Most of them have been bought up by others or have not survived, especially with the vagaries of the market ups and downs. Speaking of Next Level Games, there's some other things that they made that some other people may have heard of or not. So they've been doing exclusive work for Nintendo for the last 5 years. And they're very closely tied into Nintendo and Nintendo's primary go-to outsourced developer. Kind of cool. Well, let's take a look at the actual work of business when it comes down to games, right? This is a view of the three major indices, being the Dow, the S&P, and then the NASDAQ. During this entire period, one of the first things that gets impacted are people's ability to spend money on games. And you see these massive dips in here that basically are indicating recessions. So this is basically the entire span of my career in games, where things basically from 2000 went down a little bit, spiked back up a bit. We had this massive drop in 08, 09, starting to recover in 2010. And now we see everything climbing upwards until we hit this big drops, which is where we are today. And that essentially is the COVID crisis that we're all in. Starting to see a little bit of things rebounding, but we have to see where things end up with that. What does this actually mean for game companies? Well, I'm focusing on the Vancouver market right now because I spent 10, 11 years working there, but I'm just going to give you an idea of what happened over there. In that same period where we had Next Level Games forming and starting, Skybox starting, and continuing on, Black Box Games starting and being sold. We had Barking Dog Studios, which got sold for a rock bottom price to Rockstar Games, and they started working on a game called Bully. We had Action Pan Studios that was formed, and after 1 to 2 years was purchased by Ubisoft. We had Blue Castle Games that was formed by a couple of people that left the FIFA team and decided to set up shop in Burnaby, which eventually got purchased by Capcom Vancouver as they're making something called the Dead Rising franchise. We had Deep Fried Entertainment formed by a group of 5 or 6 really good friends out of the Need for Speed team who were tired of working on mega teams where they didn't know everybody and they wanted to work on a small team doing mobile titles working for themselves, which was great. We had Slant 6, named after an iconic engine that launched as well. They did a whole pile of games. I think they probably made about, or worked on about 10 or 12 different titles. I have to go back and double check their Wikipedia page to be sure. And then after that 5-year buyout, we had the 3 amigos that had started Black Box Games forming a company called United Front. They were there for about 3 or 4 years before finally selling out, and things changed for United Front. I recall a time in 2006 in Vancouver, there were literally a game studio starting every week for probably about 6 months. So this is just a small sample of the types of studios that were starting at that time. So the longest lasting of all these is probably 7 years. I think that might be 8 for Capcom Vancouver after the buyout. But essentially there were 3 hits that came out of this. One of them is called Sleeping Dogs. Another one was the Dead Rising franchise, and that's pretty much it. So out of all that, we've got these 3 studios, Black Box purchased by EA, Next Level running on its own, Skybox still running on its own, and this whole pile of other studios that just didn't make it. They're gone. What's the difference between all of them? Anybody know who this guy is?
Simmons.
Good one. This guy is an American-Israeli businessman. Him and his partners are responsible for a great deal of income for their particular partnership. Been in business since the 70s or the 60s, depending how you look at it. And I recall seeing a newspaper article that he did back in the early 1990s, and I was pretty astounded by what he had to say. He was talking to a bunch of aspiring artists in Ottawa. This guy's responsible for, and his business partners have dealings with all these particular areas. So from comic books to coffins to lighters to clothing to electronics, debit cards, toasters, Visa cards, photo booths. And in 2016 alone, they signed 125 new licensing partnerships. Pretty impressive. He basically had to say to all these new artists starting out, there's no such thing as your art. There's no such thing as you having to worry about the integrity of your art. You are in a business, it is a business first, and make sure that you're aware of that. So for the people that don't know who this is the brand that these guys were able to then market from the 1970s to present day, and they're still doing very well today, primarily as a marketing machine. And for those who don't know Kiss, he's the second one from the left. Right, getting back to the markets themselves. So getting back to these changes and writing out these changes in the marketplace. So a lot of those studios in Vancouver disappeared between 08 and 10. All these studios, these 3 that survived and thrived either as part of another studio or as their own, and all these that disappeared. So what's the one thing that set all these 3 apart? And what kept them going during that entire period? What's one difference that these studios had that not a single one of those other studios had? Any guesses? 3 letters. Each of these studios was started by somebody holding an MBA, either as 2 friends starting with MBAs and started as a business first who loved games, or basically, actually all 3 of them were started by MBAs, I should say, either as a solo or with a group of friends starting this particular studio. I found that to be very interesting in the grand scheme of things, because very quickly after these studios started, they either had one of these to begin with because they knew how to raise money, they had a war chest, or they built one up very, very quickly. So if you're going to be starting up a studio and you want to increase your chances, partnering with an MBA or having somebody on your team that has that knowledge of business and has built one and has access to capital or knows where to find capital is going to be one of the key things for you to be able to ride out those particular waves. Each one of those people that started those studios, when I've had conversations with them, some of them I worked with quite closely and still consider friends today, we'd be sitting around having a beer, having a coffee, and sort of chuckling because we knew that this was one of the riskiest possible businesses to start, no matter how you looked at it. So you have to be taking a look at all the different options you need to explore in order to make sure that your business survives. So what does it mean? What does it mean? It means a deep understanding of business, getting and keeping money, understanding how EBITDA works, for its earnings before income, depreciation, taxes, etc. Balance sheets, and basically they all came back to the same idea. Like, we love making games, but there's nothing that really says this is about your amazing idea or your art, despite that you love writing code or love making art. Understanding what it takes to actually build a software company up, a technology company and creative company from the ground up requires real business skills. So there are awesome books and references out there, such as the Startup J-Curve, which talk about how you adjust your business as you move forward. And so many of those studios that were started either brought an MBA in late, or they didn't have one at all, and therefore they disappeared. Also taking a look at business trends, this is something that we just couldn't predict back in the early 2000s. This is the market breakdown of the growth of the games business. So it's just shy of that 149 some odd billion that was listed earlier on before, 146, whatever the number, just shy of 150 billion. So I think this is 2018 numbers with projections for 2019 and 2020. What's really cool, looking across the bottom are the era that I grew up in, arcade machines, the big black thick bars, and then they just disappeared around the late 90s, 2000s to this one interesting little niche that they're in right now. Console was the dark gray section, which ended up growing and then ended up remaining steady, but everybody predicted consoles were going to be skyrocketing the way that we see the top blue lines here. But the one thing that wasn't taken into consideration was the creation of the handheld computer device in our hands called the smartphones. So that one market alone became so big, started taking away a lot from the console market. And at the same time, everyone's predicting the PC is going to be dead. Is the PC dead? 2000, 2002, PC sales are so low, and now PC is actually exceeding console and the kind of numbers that it's pulling in. A little eye-opening if you're thinking about making console games and going forward. What's also really neat about this is that publishers are making major decisions to be supporting the consoles coming forward. They always do. So what happened in 2005-06 and what happened in 2013? Any guesses? Well, we saw a dip in the console market back in 05 and 06. And this is basically in total sales. And we saw a dip in 2013, and it's for the same reason. At these particular times, the next generations of consoles were introduced. Why is that a problem? Well, we all know that a new generation is just about upon us. So come the fall, we're going to have one of these. We're going to have one of these massive, ugly towers. And I know I'm going to be one of the first ones to run out and buy it, maybe the second one. But here's the problem. So console release prices, from just a straight business perspective, an average console buyer, a console gamer will buy maybe between 3 titles, 4 titles, 5 titles a year. These are titles that are at the $60 to $70 range, sometimes at the $30 range. The problem is that when a new console is sold, there's only one title that gets purchased. So there's one title that sold the Xbox 360, that was Call of Duty. There was one title that was bought with the PlayStation 4 when it first came out. So the big question is, if you're starting your studio and you want to be releasing on the new console and it's going to be exciting, why would you release your new indie game on PS5 in the first year of release? No one, literally no one's going to buy it. as much as you can build up a community and all this wonderful pressure that comes up in the market space, you really have to take a look at where people are actually spending their money, especially with a really expensive console. So getting back to telling stories, we knew this coming into 2005 when we were working on the I guess it was Need for Speed Most Wanted, the first one, when we were one of the first studios to have the Xbox 360 dev kits. If anybody remembers these, they were in these giant silver Mac G4 towers. We had about 25 of them in the studio. We were the first ones outside of Microsoft to actually have them because we had committed to making a launch title for the Xbox 360. So we were one team, massively funded in order to be able to make this particular title. In June, in E3, an exec came back and said, after taking a look at the entire the Xbox 360 lineup, basically said, everybody's got more titles for the Xbox 360 than we do. Therefore, all of your games across the studio are now going to be Xbox 360 games. Think about that for a second. We had 1,800 employees, 1,836 actually, 140 people in management, all basically collectively sit up and say, this must be some kind of joke. But instead, millions were spent in trying to then up-res all of the, basically tighten up the graphics of all of our games to make them run on Xbox 360. And it was a very, very expensive endeavor for something that just didn't sell. So even though all the initial money was poured into Most Wanted, everybody bought Call of Duty, made by our friendly competition around the corner. There wasn't NHL, it wasn't rugby, it wasn't FIFA, it wasn't Madden that was purchased in these huge numbers in 2005 on the launch of the Xbox 360. And the same thing's gonna be happening right now. So just as a reminder, when a gamer buys a new console, they're gonna buy one game for it, and that's it. The entire budget for the gaming year is literally gone if they buy that console when it first comes out. So it's just a very interesting example of how sometimes people will take the emotion of what they see at something like E3 and base major business decisions on it that have long-ranging impacts. The same group of individuals invested up to, actually it's a little more than 80 million doing exercise videos or exercise video games that never actually saw the light of day. And on top of that, we had really interesting problems with how they were going to, like some of these executives moving on to Xbox and how they're going to be sharing games. And then that ended up being a cause of derision in the marketplace for having the fact that people would have to trade a game with somebody and then trade the license back and forth. And they wanted to have a chunk of the license revenue. And that was just really poorly received. And in the end, they had to backtrack about that. So that's the business side. All this stuff is crammed into the business end of things. So let's take a look at the project management side. How many games are late? Any takers on that question? Ballpark? Actually, that answer in chat is correct. It is all of them, depending how you take a look at it. There's the classic project management triangle of time, features, and budget, and some people add quality in here as well as to what it actually takes to manage a software development project. And at the end of the day, games are software, right? So the usual approach that I take when I'm in a client relationship is that, hey, Mr. or Ms. Client, you can own 2 of these, but I own 1. So if you want to know exactly how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take, we'll tell you what the features and scope are going to be, but you can't have all 3. And we easily trade off either one of these. The problem in the games industry right now is that, especially in large AAA teams, that there isn't a very realistic concept of scope control. And the end result is this. So we end up with trying to cram as many more features in as we possibly can up until the last minute. Teams are crunched. And then when people are working at those kind of levels, they're not exactly producing their best work. So here's the reality of crunch. Your quality of life ends up being nothing, and your quality of work ends up being far below what you could possibly do. And one of the reasons I'm really happy working in a studio like Snowed In, doing a little plug here, is that we're a no-crunch studio. We have clients that are asking us to do it at times, and we push back. For the most part, it's just something that we know is not going to be productive, is not going to be sustainable. And on top of that, we want to have a really good quality of life for everybody around to really enjoy the work that everybody does. So it's impossible to do with crunch. The other thing about crunch as well is that typically what a studio will tell their employees is that we're going to be crunching now, but don't worry, you're going to get compensatory time or comp time at the end of the project, and everything's going to be great. So you crunch for 6 months, and then you get an extra 4 days off or 5 days off, 2 weeks if you're lucky. But how do you explain that when you've missed kids' birthdays or your own birthday or any other family events, or the fact that that crunch period is always at the same time of year, which is typically the summer? Another thing that happened in the console world, which is changing now with digital games, is that you had to have all your games done by the end of August at the latest, maybe early September if you're lucky, because it took 6 to 8 weeks to go through the entire manufacturing cycle to get these games on the shelf for the one day a year that sold more games than any other, which is Black Friday in the US on the Thanksgiving long weekend. So essentially everybody's crunching at the same time. You miss the nicest part of the year and then it's all gone. The other kind of things you end up with crunch when you're doing this thing with no scope control are a whole bunch of alleged human rights violations. When I was working at EA, we had this really interesting email chain going around internally first called EA Spouse. If you've never heard of it, it's a really interesting thing to look up. In fact, at the beginning, this person was extremely anonymous. We had no idea who they were, and it hit the airwaves of the regular television and news media. And we had a lot of questions coming at us about what it's really like working in the games industry. The end result of the EA Spouse issue was basically 3 class action lawsuits for labor practices, and that was a whole thing that lots of issues that EA had to manage after that. We've got the Team Bondi experience that happened for the production of LA Noire, where everybody was treated really poorly. And unfortunately, again, I don't want to gloss over the games industry, but there are a lot of places where this is happening on a frequent basis. We could just do a quick search on Google about games industry development practices, and you'll find lots of examples stretching up even to present day where people are having issues with it. So it really ends up with, without having that kind of scope control and an idea of what you should be putting out each year, more issues like this, and we've all seen this, right? I'm not hating on Mass Effect Andromeda, but hey, well, I mean, you end up with all sorts of weird bugs that happen and massive day one patches where you're downloading 6 gigs of a game that you've already purchased on a disc. So really what it boils down to is that one of the most difficult things to get across in the development of games is getting back to the basics of project management. The 5 stages of a project: initiation, planning, execution, monitoring, control, and closure. But here's the greatest thing. I've had so many people over the years say, okay, so you're a project manager, we don't make regular software. I'm sorry, darling, we make games. Games are very different. And to that, I always have the same answer. That's not true. We're making software very much with a creative bent to it. I totally agree. But at the end of the day, we are not shipping a hard copy piece of art. We are shipping an executable that's built on software development principles. Yes, there are major differences. Yes, there are things like emergent gameplay. Yes, unlike a film, we have to render it in real time with all the changes the player's making as opposed to just rendering it once. But at the end of the day, we're still making software and we still have to follow sound software development practices. And again, customized to what we need to do for the games industry. I'm not a religious process fanatic, but process does need to have a place in game development. So the other question is, isn't crunch necessary? And my personal answer is never. Project discipline and business discipline definitely are. All right, so that's all the business stuff. Already at 45 minutes, I'm going to be going over the next bits and pieces rather quickly, so I don't want to be glossing over too much, but I just want to talk briefly about a couple of things that I think are really important. So from the tech of play, we talked about the work of play and the business of play. It's all about the right tools and the right pipeline. This is just some of the things that I've learned over time. So when it comes down to tools, if you want to get into games, C++ is it. It doesn't matter if everybody's telling you they can make HTML games, they can make games doing all sorts of other technologies with C#, which is great, which is awesome. By all means, if that's what you want to do. But if you want a long career in games and you want to be successful as a programmer, C++ is it. And I know that because when I was hiring developers back in 1994 for my own software company, C++ we knew was going to be the #1 technology that we'd be hiring for. In 2000 and 2002 and 2004 and 2008, 2012 and 2020, C++ is still the primary skill that's required in games. You may have other contracts that are available for a short period of time in C# or other technologies, but you want to have a long and steady career in games, C++ is it. Every studio is looking for C++ developers. You can't stress that enough. The next bit about tech is the pipeline. People often come in and say, well, we have this wonderful series of concepts, but you know, we've got this great prototype that we're working on. whenever you walk into a new game team, the first thing you have to ask yourself the question is, what's the status of the pipeline? Can you actually take an asset, whether it's AI, art, a vehicle, a weapon, crunch that into an executable and play that? And surprisingly, a lot of game companies that have been working on something for a year still don't have a playable pipeline where at any time during the day you can press a button, get an executable after running a build for an hour, 6 hours, whatever the process happens to be, and then actually see those assets in game. So getting that pipeline set up early is key. So one of the first questions that come into a new team is always, what's the status of the pipeline? Show me it, walk me through all the steps of it, make sure it works daily, play your game daily. I'm going to talk briefly about art. This one actually is kind of funny. I took an art course about 8-9 years ago at, I think it was the Ottawa School of Art, just a drawing course because I love to draw. And the first thing the instructor says is, artists will never make any money. And I was just like, well, for the people on this call anyway, do you remember that list of salaries that I showed up at the front? Half of those were for artists, by the way. And I basically just like, I got an idea here. Everything in here is art. So this is in-game art that's now been rendered on screen. This is an actual in-game screenshot from an active game today. So any guesses to the number of different art roles that made this one? I can look at this right now and I see 5 right off the top of my head. How about how many artists have made this one? Before you even get to programming and gameplay. Well, there's a whole pile of them right here. So this is just for this one area of a game. This doesn't take into account building an entire world. This doesn't take into account audio, UI, all the front end and sound effects that go along with that as well. So artists can make money and artists can do very well. So I take a look at this one particular video that I showed that we put together. It just basically shows half of the world that we built for a particular racing game back in the day. And all of these artists were making a minimum of 40K back in 2005 and some of them well over 6 figures. So I just had to laugh at that. So a little bit about art and game design. I'm going to touch on this just very briefly, but a couple of things about the whole design pipeline. Make sure you're playing your game every day. No one gets the design loop right the first time around. It's all design, iterate, and listen to what Stephen King said about writing, and that's kill your darlings. Make sure that you have all these things that you've worked on for a while. You get attached to it and somebody else goes and does something completely different with it and you realize you have to change things. Take these characters that you love, kill them, move on, and have that as part of your initial experience, and then build something really amazing about. Some things I wish I knew about before I started was unplanned emergent gameplay. Basically, you put a whole bunch of features together, and then suddenly you get something new that you never even knew was there. The best example I can give of this is 1996, watching the Doom Championships, and somebody did rocket jumping for the first time, and all of our jaws dropped, including the guys that had written this game at id Software. They had no idea somebody could do this. I had no idea how licensing works, and the fact that every piece of branded material you see in every piece of entertainment that somebody has sold, so it doesn't matter if it's film, movies, radio, everything is paid for and paid for and paid for and paid for. So you want to get a song in there from AC/DC, 100,000 to start with for distribution in the game, probably more. You want to get a song from just maybe a 5-second clip, that's 50,000 to start with, probably more. And there's a whole business built around brokers to actually go and get this music out for you. Some companies do this themselves. Some people go through third parties. I had no idea how this worked. Same thing with sports titles. You want to make an NHL title, you pay the league. You pay the league $1 million just to be able to say the word NHL and use the shield and the stadiums and the team logos. You want the players, you pay another $500,000 to be able to use the actual player faces in the game. And then you can import the databases and start wrapping the heads around your player model and use them from there. And then you want to use a Coho stick, you pay another 50 grand to 200 grand to Coho to use the one Coho stick everywhere in the game. But of course, Bauer's going to have something to say about that. And they'll say, well, how come you're not using our sticks? You're going to have to pay another 50 to 100 grand if you put that in there, if you want to use if you want to use our sticks. And it's a really interesting world because sometimes the brand will actually pay you to put their stuff in there as a particular logo in the game, as Singular did with Need for Speed Underground 2, which gave us some extra money that we could actually go and make that game with. The other thing is that brands are super protective of their brand, super protective of their logo. So you have to make sure that that brand integrity is really, really tight. Right. I'm going to go over this really quickly. I'm almost out of time because all this could be a talk in and of itself. People, management versus leadership. What does that actually mean? I kind of grew up in the military system where management's a science about moving people and material to get a mission accomplished. leadership is an art, and art has to be practiced. So a couple of things you have to learn as a manager are the things like employment standards, business management, entertainment-specific regulation. GDPR has been really huge over the last couple of years. COPA has been big since at least 2011. CASL in Canada for anti-spam legislation, things like that. All these things affect how you're going to be implementing your game. And of course, the basics of project management, as I mentioned earlier on. And what is leadership then? So management is one thing. What is actual leadership? Well, it's a much bigger topic that we can talk about here, but it's basically influencing a group to attain a goal, to attain a vision, and it is an art. It's essentially, if you go back to Simon Sinek's view of leadership, it's putting yourself in harm's way for the benefit of the group, which kind of turns leadership on its head for a lot of people. And in my view, it's always putting your team first in all circumstances. Getting back to Simon Sinek's book title, Why Leaders Eat Last. It's a very complex, deep topic. It's very simple in its principles, but not easy. So how do I become a leader? In my view, these are the things you need to do. Follow a list of leadership principles. I've got my own. I print them out, put them up on the wall. I hand them out to people when they're asking what makes a good leader. I say, here's a list of 10 things. This is what you need to do. And then constantly refine it. And here's that list of 10. Again, this is based on the military leadership system of the Canadian Forces through the 1980s and early 1990s. So I'd love to be able to talk about this, but basically it's a huge topic outside the scope of today. I'm going to talk briefly about ethics and industry issues. We know that all these things happen. Racism, especially in light of today's current circumstances, we can't gloss over this. It's a huge deal. Racism is the reason I left my previous job. Misogyny is still a huge problem in the games industry. Gamergate's big. So I'm really glad that we've got the gender gaps closing in people that are playing games, and hopefully we're going to be seeing the same thing when it comes down to the management of game companies themselves. Anybody tells you from point number 2 that violent games don't influence behavior is probably somebody that's lobbying for the games industry. Every bit of psychological study I did for my psych degree basically said, I'm sorry, but this is exactly what happens through exposure therapy. You get exposed to something more times over, it becomes less of an issue. If you're in a situation where you're dehumanizing people, it's easier for you to do that in real life. And I think we're actually seeing that in a lot of the online anonymous, quote unquote, people saying crazy things online in communities. So one thing to be aware of. Other issues that we have to deal with are crunch, gambling issues, because gambling addiction is another problem that's coming up. Cheating in esports, it's definitely the Wild West out there, and people are using performance enhancing, there are rumors of people using performance enhancing drugs in esports, and then social justice messaging like the current things that we have today. So many companies have put out messages saying, we stand behind Black Lives Matter, but nobody's saying anything about what's happening in the Indigenous communities. Nobody has these people that are actually part of their board of directors. So you basically have to take a look at things with a bit of a critical eye. As someone who self-identifies as a Black man in the games industry, although I come from mixed heritage, I've experienced all of these things. And I have to take a look at these things again with a critical eye. Right, and basically it's on all of us, right? We are part of this industry, and it's on all of us to change it, one small piece at a time. Briefly about ethics, people will pirate your stuff. You'll have the opportunity to pirate stuff yourself, but if you're going to do that, you're in the wrong business. If you have to steal something, go do something else. The best piece of advice from one of my mentors, don't mess with someone else's partner, don't mess with someone else's money. When you're stealing ideas, you're messing with someone else's money. All right, so a couple of brief points in hiring. Make sure you test your candidates, hire for skills, not friends. Be aware that you do have biases. Be aware that psychopaths will get into your hiring pipeline. The entertainment industry attracts them, and understand what psychopathy actually is, as opposed to what we see with the mass murderers out there. Psychopaths can destroy a business. Learn a bit about psychology and you'll be hiring better people. Right. So closing this off, I'm running over my time. I wanted to be done about 10 minutes before, but I wanted to close with a couple of thoughts. It takes a lot of effort to make games, and it's totally worth it. But you don't get into game development just on a force of will alone. In fact, so many times, I wish I had literally a dollar bill, if we still had them, maybe a loonie, for every time somebody basically come to me and said, somebody I know in the games industry said it'd be really good, can I get a shot at being a producer in your company? And this actually happened to me last year twice. And I said, sure, here's your shot. Here's a list of all the things you need to know. Pick 2 of these and become an expert in 1, maybe 2 of these. Show me that you're willing to do this, and then let's have a conversation in 6 months. And then every time I've done this, I want people to join this industry. I want people to do well. they come back and say, man, that's a lot of work. I really don't think, I got this going on in my life, got that going on in my life. It's like, you asked for a shot, that's your shot. I mean, you have the opportunity to do this. Find a skill in programming and art and project management and team management, whatever the case may be, but show that you're willing to make that effort to get into it and you can do it. Learn about business, learn about leadership and mentoring. And then, as I said at the beginning of it, feel free to throw out every single thing I've said here and find your own way and then tell me about it, because I'd love to hear about it. I'd love to hear about people succeeding in this business, because I love the business myself. I love the people that are in it. And I love the fact that when you can walk into a store and walk into an EB Games and somebody picks something off the shelf and you know the people that made it and you hear them say, this is the greatest thing ever. You have to get this to their best friend beside you. So that's it for me for today. I want to say thank you.